Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Carly no longer had any doubt. The mounting signs, once isolated fragments, had finally aligned into a chilling, irrefutable truth. It was Willow who had been silently, insidiously approaching Daisy in recent weeks. Sasha's escalating panic, her mounting unease, and Willow's strange behavioral shifts no longer appeared as isolated incidents. They formed a sinister pattern, a tapestry of manipulation and obsession. Carly, whose life had been built on protecting those she loved, especially the children tied to her bloodline, acted swiftly and decisively. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten publicly. Her brand of protection was precise, cold, and merciless when necessary. She wasn't just a mother or a grandmother, she was a force of nature when her family was under threat. One quiet evening at the Quartermain estate, that force revealed itself. Willow, unaware of what awaited her, stepped into the dimly lit kitchen. The room was blanketed in shadows, save for the soft, strategic glow of a lone pendant light hanging above the dining table. There, in the eerie half-light, sat Carly. Her posture was serene, composed, yet there was an unmistakable charge in the air. In her hand, Carly held a printed image, grainy, black and white, but damning. It showed a female figure, her identity unmistakable despite the blurred angle, bending over Daisy's crib in a moment that had never been permitted nor known. The silence between them was deafening. Carly did not speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes, cold as steel, met Willow's in a confrontation more psychologically scarring than any tirade. Her slight, crooked smile was not one of amusement but a warning, a calculated signal of power. Willow felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands trembled violently. The air around her thickened with dread. There was no mistaking Carly's message, she knew, and she would not tolerate even the whisper of a threat to Daisy. Carly did not deliver threats about pool privileges or social boundaries, her threats were silent promises that the next time, the consequences would be irreversible. Willow staggered backward, her flight-or-fight instincts triggered, her mind in a tailspin. In her rush to flee the room, she dropped her car keys on the rug, her hands shaking too violently to pick them up. Carly said nothing, simply watched. That was the intended effect, leave Willow dismantled, unraveled, and haunted by the silent reckoning she had just witnessed. While Willow spiraled, frantically seeking validation and comfort from Drew, Carly was already moving pieces behind the scenes. She met discreetly with Michael, revealing what she knew and carefully guiding him through the emotional chaos threatening to consume their family. She didn't stop there. With clinical efficiency, she reached out to Alexis and Jason, forming a protective ring around Daisy and Sasha. Every window in Sasha's home was inspected and replaced. Surveillance systems were upgraded to military precision. Jason deployed trusted associates to conduct quiet but constant monitoring of the area surrounding Sasha's residence. Nothing was left to chance. Every possible vulnerability was sealed. Carly knew Willow inside and out. She had once seen her as a source of stability. But now, stripped of reason and driven by desperation, Willow was a variable too dangerous to ignore. Sasha, long painted as fragile, unwell, and emotionally volatile, emerged in this chaos as the voice of reason. Her proposal to leave Port Charles with Daisy was not born of fear but instinct, a mother's knowledge that something unseen, unspoken, was targeting her child. But Michael, torn between his duty as a father and his unresolved attachment to Willow, refused. He wanted Daisy safe, but he also wanted accountability. He couldn't let Willow slip away, not after everything she had done. Carly watched this conflict brew in him, knowing that her son's heart was too fractured to make the hard choices. So she made them for him. She went to Sunny. In a rare moment of vulnerability laced with urgency, Carly stood before him and stated her truth. She could not, and would not, lose another child, not to violence, not to emotional sabotage, not to a manipulator masquerading as a victim. Her words weren't a plea. They were a command born of raw, maternal instinct. She demanded that Sonny call off whatever plan he had to retaliate against Marco and instead redirect that energy toward the only battle that mattered, protecting Daisy. Sonny, reading the depth of resolve in her eyes, agreed. For once, vengeance would wait. Protection came first. Still, Jason continued tracking Holden and the shadowy agents associated with Selena Wu. Carly had her suspicions, and they were darker than most would believe. She no longer saw Willow as acting alone. The erratic behavior, the delusions, the obsession, it was too orchestrated, too methodical. Carly suspected Willow was being used, that some deeper power, Sidwell, perhaps, or a covert adversary, was manipulating her like a pawn. And in Port Charles, pawns never moved without a player behind them. Carly knew how to handle players. She'd done it all her life. And now, as the web tightened, as the lines between sanity and obsession blurred, Carly stood quietly in the center of the storm she had foreseen long before anyone else did. She wasn't waiting for the next crisis, she was preparing for it. The threat wasn't over. The darkness clinging to Willow was only part of something larger. Carly didn't know when it would strike again, or how, but she would be ready. Because that's what she had always been. The protector. The shield. The mother lion with teeth bared. And if Willow ever came near Daisy again, Carly wouldn't just frighten her. She would end her. In the days that followed Carly's silent confrontation with Willow, the battle for Daisy's safety quietly evolved into something more intricate, strategic, and far-reaching than anyone outside their circle could imagine. Carly, with her unmatched instinct for protecting her family, began convening a series of secret meetings with Elizabeth and Alexis, two women she trusted not only for their loyalty but for their professional insight into emotional trauma, legal boundaries, and community perception. These gatherings took place at odd hours, in neutral, quiet spaces, a back room in Alexis' office, the closed-off nurses' lounge at General Hospital, and even a secluded corner of Ava's gallery after hours. The purpose was simple but urgent: formulate a plan that would fortify Daisy's world against any further breach, especially from within the family. Carly understood that they needed more than just security cameras and locked doors. This wasn't about physical protection alone, it was about psychological insulation, rebuilding Sasha's trust in her own instincts, and sealing off every crack Willow might exploit again. Elizabeth, as both a nurse and someone with deep emotional insight, brought a measured perspective. She emphasized the need to monitor Daisy's reactions, moods, and possible trauma responses, understanding that even subtle cues from a baby could indicate if someone had recently interacted with her without consent. Alexis, on the other hand, began outlining the legal parameters, restraining orders, guardianship conditions, visitation protocols. All while maintaining discretion, knowing that once the courts were involved, the narrative could spiral out of their control. It was during one such quiet meeting at Ava's gallery that Rick arrived unexpectedly, carrying a bouquet of lilies meant to brighten Ava's workspace and lift the mood. He wasn't supposed to hear any of it. But as he stepped into the room and saw the grim faces of Carly, Elizabeth, and Alexis, he instinctively knew this wasn't just another social visit. Rick had always been shrewd, and as soon as he picked up on the mentions of Willow and the escalating security concerns surrounding Daisy, his demeanor shifted. Rather than asking to be excluded, Rick offered his help. He admitted he had sensed something off for weeks, not just with Willow's increasingly erratic behavior, but with Ava's refusal to fully acknowledge the tension. He suggested implementing subtle security upgrades at the gallery and even hiring a private investigator to independently trace Willow's movements in recent weeks. He, too, suspected that Willow wasn't acting alone, that someone, perhaps operating from the shadows, was manipulating her like a puppet. Carly accepted Rick's offer, not because she fully trusted him, but because she knew he had the resources and motivation to act swiftly. Rick still cared for Elizabeth, and by extension, had a vested interest in the safety of the broader family network. More importantly, he had once lived in the gray spaces of the law. He knew how to push the boundaries of legality without crossing them entirely. And right now, that was exactly the kind of help Carly needed. While Carly and her network were closing in on every vulnerability, Willow's psychological state was deteriorating at an alarming pace. The woman who once wore calm-like armor now appeared constantly on edge. She jumped at sudden noises, flinched when someone entered a room too quietly, and had developed a compulsive habit of checking her phone every few minutes. Her sleep patterns fractured into insomnia-fueled spirals. At night, she would lie awake, wide-eyed, listening for phantom footsteps in the hallway or the distant click of a camera shutter. Her thoughts became tangled, looping back to Carly's eyes. The way they had bored into her without saying a single word, speaking volumes through silence. The guilt that had once been a whisper was now a deafening roar in her head. Willow began muttering to herself during simple tasks, holding full conversations with no one. She would pace her apartment, clutching her phone like it might suddenly explode with a damning message or photo, and when the screen remained blank, her panic only grew. At work, her demeanor shifted from cold to jittery, as if she was constantly preparing for an ambush. Even Drew, who had stood by her through many storms, began to notice that she avoided eye contact, mumbled half-responses, and recoiled from even the gentlest forms of affection. When he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, she flinched, not because of the gesture, but because it mirrored too closely the imagined touch of someone reaching for her in the dark. It wasn't long before those closest to her began whispering that something was wrong. Willow's isolation deepened, not because others pushed her away, but because she began pushing them first. She declined calls from Christina, ignored texts from Molly, and even refused visits from Wiley, claiming vague headaches or exhaustion. But the truth was, she couldn't face her son knowing what she had done. Every time she looked into his eyes, she saw Sasha's, the quiet strength, the maternal fire. And it made her skin crawl with shame. Her paranoia mutated into delusion. She started believing that the pictures Carly had shown her that night, the ones of her leaning over Daisy, were being duplicated and spread. She imagined Jason's men watching her through tinted car windows, imagined Alexis sending coded warnings through her legal advice. She even began suspecting Drew, believing he might have conspired with Carly to trap her. She started deleting apps, clearing her call logs, and hiding in corners of coffee shops to make phone calls under fake names. But the more she tried to control her environment, the more fractured her mind became. And Carly watched from afar, not with joy or triumph, but with cold calculation. She didn't need to destroy Willow. She only needed Willow to destroy herself. Carly had already made her move. Now, the slow collapse of Willow's psyche was simply the natural consequence of truth colliding with guilt. And while Port Charles carried on, its people distracted by new crimes, scandals, and betrayals, a quieter storm raged just beneath the surface. A woman unraveling. A family shielding its most innocent member. And one matriarch watching it all with unflinching resolve, determined that no harm would ever touch Daisy again, no matter how far she had to go or how many minds she had to break to ensure it. Then, one morning, Willow awoke to something that would shatter what little remained of her psychological composure. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, disoriented from yet another night of restless sleep and fragmented dreams, but the moment she glanced around the room, a creeping chill began to climb her spine. Her bedroom, once a sanctuary of soft colors and calm order, was no longer her own. It was a gallery of terror. Dozens of photographs, printed in varying sizes, were strewn across the walls, the floor, and even taped across her closet mirror. They weren't random shots. They were time-stamped images from security footage, each one capturing her in precise, undeniable moments, leaning over Daisy's crib, reaching toward the child, sometimes standing eerily close with a blank expression in the darkened nursery. The photos were taken from different angles, different times, different days, proof that someone had been watching her as she watched Daisy. And beneath every image, scrawled in jagged, almost childlike handwriting, was the same haunting phrase repeated over and over, "the last time." The words burned into her brain, clawing at every corner of her consciousness. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in broken gasps as if the oxygen had suddenly been sucked from the room. Her legs trembled, her knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor, clutching the edge of her bed as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Panic overcame her. Rational thought slipped through her fingers like sand. She had no memory of how the photos had gotten there, no idea how someone had bypassed her locked doors, her bolted windows. But they had. And that was what made it unbearable. Someone had been in her home, close enough to touch her, to study her. Someone had known her routines, her weaknesses, her fears. Someone had wanted her to see this. To feel this. To unravel. In a frenzy, Willow scrambled to the door, yanking it open with such force that the frame splintered slightly. She didn't grab her purse. She didn't lock the door behind her. She ran, barefoot, half-dressed, hair wild and matted to her damp forehead, into the street. Her mind was a kaleidoscope of confusion, horror, and disbelief. She couldn't scream. Her throat was clenched too tight. Her vision blurred as tears flooded her eyes, mixing with the sweat that streamed down her face. She didn't know where she was running. She just needed to escape. As she reached the intersection at the bottom of the hill, her foot caught the edge of the curb. She stumbled, arms flailing, and lurched directly into the path of an oncoming car. The screech of tires slashing across asphalt sliced through the air. Horns blared. People shouted. But just before the vehicle could strike her, a pair of arms reached out, strong and steady, and yanked her back with just enough force to avoid disaster. It was Christina. Of all people, it was Christina who caught her. The same Christina who had once sensed something deeply wrong in Willow's behavior when they shared brief, tense moments at Ava's gallery. The same Christina who had asked questions, who had watched with wary eyes while others looked away. She didn't ask why Willow was in the street. She didn't demand answers. She simply held on to her as Willow collapsed into her arms, her body racked with sobs, her hands gripping Christina's shirt like a lifeline. In that singular, catastrophic moment, something in Willow broke. Not in the loud, cinematic way people often imagine breakdowns, but in the quiet, internal crumbling of someone who realized they had been cornered by a force far greater than shame or regret. This was not about guilt anymore. It was about fear, deep, unrelenting fear, that she would never again be safe, never again be unseen. Willow knew then that Carly hadn't needed to press charges, hadn't needed to make her a pariah in the public eye. Carly had delivered something far more brutal, psychological isolation, an invisible cage lined with mirrors reflecting Willow's own descent. No one had physically hurt her. No one had raised a hand. But every breath she took from that moment forward felt watched. Every room she entered felt compromised. Every phone call she made felt monitored. Carly had weaponized the very air Willow breathed, turning her paranoia into prophecy. Everyone became a potential threat, Jason's men in shadowed corners, Alexis with her cryptic legal advice, even Drew, who now seemed too quiet, too composed, too distant. Had he known all along? Had he been feeding information to Carly? That was the brilliance, and the cruelty, of Carly's retribution. It wasn't a slap or a scream. It wasn't a public indictment or a scandalous exposé. It was the suffocating knowledge that nothing Willow did from this point on would be private. That her secrets were no longer hers. That someone was always a step ahead. Carly had built a web, not to catch her, but to make her believe she was already caught. And in Willow's rapidly unraveling mind, belief had become truth. She didn't return to her apartment that day. She couldn't. The idea of facing those photographs again, those frozen moments of betrayal staring back at her, was too much. She checked into a motel under a false name, paying in cash, avoiding mirrors, turning her phone off and removing the battery just to be safe. She lay awake at night, waiting for the knock on the door that might never come. But the silence was worse than any confrontation. Because in that silence lived Carly's ghost, always watching, always reminding her, you crossed a line, and this mental purgatory, is your reckoning. And somewhere in the quiet corners of Port Charles, Carly didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply carried on with her life, knowing that justice had been served, not through the courts, not with handcuffs or headlines, but with the quiet annihilation of Willow's peace. To Carly, this was the only justice that mattered. Not the kind written into law, but the kind born from instinct, from fury, from the sacred duty of a woman who would protect her granddaughter at all costs, even if it meant unraveling someone she once called family. And so, in the aftermath of shadows and whispers, what remained was not victory or vengeance, but a fragile, uneasy silence blanketing Port Charles. Willow, once seen as a pillar of quiet strength, now existed as a hollow echo of the woman she used to be. Haunted by her own actions, broken by the invisible force of a reckoning she never saw coming. Her days became an endless loop of avoidance and paranoia, her nights an unrelenting parade of dreams that mirrored her fears. She had become a ghost in her own life, cut off from the people she once loved, too ashamed to face the reflection of who she had become. She was not imprisoned by bars or court rulings, but by her conscience, sharpened and turned against her by the very woman who once stood at her side as family. Carly, for her part, never uttered a word about the photographs or the psychological trap she had laid. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any accusation, more effective than any courtroom testimony. She continued her days with deliberate calm, focusing on rebuilding what Willow had nearly broken. Sasha and Daisy thrived under the new layers of protection.